Stories from the Diary of a Doctor by L.T. Meade and Clifton Halifax, M.D. An Oak Coffin. On a certain cold morning in early spring, I was visited by two ladies, a mother and a daughter. The mother was dressed as a widow. She was a tall, striking-looking woman with full, wide-open dark eyes, and a mass of rich hair turned back with a white and noble brow. Her lips were firm, her features well-formed. She seemed to have plenty of character, but the deep lines of sadness under her eyes and round her lips were very remarkable. The daughter was a girl of 14, slim and weediness. Her eyes were dark like her mother's, but she had an abundance of tawny brown and very handsome hair. It hung down her back below her waist and floated over her shoulders. She was dressed, like her mother, in heavy mourning, and round her young mouth and dark, deep eyes there lingered the same inexpressible sadness. I motioned my visitors to chairs and waited as usual to learn the reason of their favoring me with a call. "My name is Heathcote," said the older lady. "I have lately lost my husband, and I have come to you on account of my daughter. She is not well." I glanced again attentively at the young girl. I saw that she looked overstrained and nervous. Her restlessness, too, was apparent, so that she could scarcely sit still, and cracking up a paper knife which stood at the table near, she began twirling rapidly between her fingers and thumb. "It does me good to fidget with something," she said, glancing apologetically at her mother. "What are your daughter's symptoms?" I asked. Mrs. Heathcote began to describe them in the vague way which characterizes from a certain class of patient. I gathered at last from her words that Gabrielle would not eat. She slept badly, she was weak and depressed, and she took no interest in anything. "How old is Miss Gabrielle?" I asked. "She will be 15 her next birthday," replied her mother. All the while Mrs. Heathcote was speaking, the young daughter kept her eyes fixed on the carpet, and still twirled the paper knife, and once or twice she yawned profoundly. I asked her to prepare for the usual medical examination. She complied without elasticity, and with a look on her face which she said plainly, "Young as I am, I know how useless it is to fuss at all. I only submit because I must." I felt her pulse and sounded her heart and lungs. The action of her heart was a little weak, but the lungs were perfectly healthy. In short, beyond a general physical and mental debility, I could find nothing whatsoever matter with the girl. After a time, I rang the bell to desire my servant to take Miss Heathcote into another room, in order that I might speak to her mother alone. The young lady went away very unwillingly. The skeptical expression on her face was more apparent than ever. "You'll be sure to tell me all the exact truth," said Miss Heathcote, as soon as we were all alone. "I have very little to tell," I replied. "I have examined your daughter carefully. She is suffering from no disease to which a name can be attached. She is below par, certainly, but there is weakness and general depression. But a tonic might set all these matters right." "I've tried tonics without avail," said Mrs. Heathcote. "Has your family physician not seen Mrs. Heathcote?" "Not lately." The widow's manner became decidedly hesitating. "And the fact is, we have not consulted him since Mr. Heathcote's death," she said. "When did that take place?" "6 months ago." Here she spoke with an infinite sadness, and her face, already very pale, turned perceptibly paler. Is there nothing you can tell me to give me a clue of your daughter's... Is there nothing you can tell me to give me a clue of your daughter's condition? Is there anything, for instance, preying on her mind?" "Nothing whatsoever." The expression on her face was very sad for so young a girl. "You must remember," said Mrs. Heathcote, "that she recently has lost her father." Even so, I replied, that would scarcely account for a nervous condition, and a healthy-minded child will not be overcome with grief to the serious detriment of health after an interval of 6 months, at least, I added. That is my experience in ordinary cases. I'm grieved to hear it, said Mrs. Heathcote. She looked very much troubled. Her agitation was apparent in the trembling hands and quivering lips. Your daughter is in a nervous condition, I said, rising. She has no disease at present, but a little extra strain might develop real disease, or might affect her nerves, already overstrung, to a dangerous degree. I should recommend complete change of air and scenery immediately. Mrs. Heathcote sighed heavily. You don't look very well yourself, I said, giving her a keen glance. She flushed crimson. I've felt my sorrow accurately, she said. I made a few more general remarks, wrote a prescription for the daughter, and bade Mrs. Heathcote goodbye. About the same hour on the following morning, I was astonished when my servant brought me a card on which was scribbled in pencil the name Gabrielle Heathcote, and underneath, in the same upright but unformed hand, the words, I want to see you most urgently. A few moments later, Miss Gabrielle was standing in my room. Her appearance was much the same as yesterday, except now that her face was eager, watchful, and awake. How do you do? She said, holding out her hand and blushing. I ventured to come alone. I haven't brought a fee. Does that matter? Not at the least, I replied. Pray, sit down and tell me what you want. I would rather stand, she answered. I feel too restless and decided to sit still. I stole away from home without letting Mother know. I liked your look yesterday and determined to see you again. Now, may I confide in you? You certainly may, I replied. My interest in this queer child was a good deal aroused. I felt certain that I was right in my conjectures of yesterday, and that this young creature had really burdens with some secrets that was gravely undermining her own health. I am willing to listen to you, I continued. You must be brief, of course, for I am a very busy man, but anything you can say which will throw light into your own condition, and so help me cure you, will, of course, be welcome. You think me very nervous, said Miss Gabrielle. Your nerves are out of order. Yes, I know that. I don't sleep at night. Yes? Miss Gabrielle looked towards the door. Is it shut? She asked excitedly. Of course it is. She came close to me. Her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Her face turned not only gray, or white, but gray. I can stand it no longer, she said. I'll tell you the truth. You wouldn't sleep either if you were me. My father isn't dead. Nonsense, I replied. You must control such imaginings, Miss Gabrielle, or you can really get into your very unhealthy condition of your mind. That's what Mother says when I speak to her, replied the child. But I tell you, this is true. My father is not dead. I know it. How can you possibly know it? I asked. I've seen him. There. You've seen your father, but he died 6 months ago. Yes, he died and was buried, and I went to his funeral, but all the same, he is not dead now. My dear young lady, I said, as in a soothing tone as I could assume, you are the victim of what is called a hallucination. You have felt your father's death very acutely. I have. I loved him beyond words. He was so kind, so affectionate, and so good to me. It almost broke my heart when he died. I thought I could never be happy again. Mother was as wretched as myself. There weren't two more miserable people in the wide world. It seemed impossible to either of us to smile and be cheerful again. I began to sleep badly, for I cried so much. My eyes ached, and I did not care much for lessons any more. All those feelings will pass, I replied. They are natural, but some time will abate their violence. You think so? Said the girl with a strange smile. Now let me go on with my story. It was Christmas time when I first saw my father. We lived in an old house in Brixton. It was a walled-in garden. I was standing by my window about midnight. I had been in bed for an hour or more, but I could not sleep. The house was perfectly quiet. I got out of bed and went to the window and drew up the blind. I stood by the window and looked out into the garden, which was covered with snow. There, standing under the window, with his arms folded, was Father. He stood perfectly still and turned his head slowly, first in the direction of my room and then in that of my mother's. He stood there for quite 5 minutes and then walked across the grass into the shelter of a shrubbery. I put on a cloak and rushed downstairs. I unbolted the front door and went into the garden. I shouted my father's name and ran into the shrubbery to look for him, but he wasn't there. And I think I fainted. When I came to myself, I was in bed and Mother was bending over me. Her face was all blistered as if she had been crying terribly. I told her what I had just seen Father, and she said it was just a dream. So it was, I replied. Miss Gabrielle's dark brows were knit in some pain. I did not think you would take that commonplace view, she responded. I'm sorry if I've offended you, I answered. Girls like you do have bad dreams when they're in trouble, and those dreams are often so vivid that they mistake them for realities. Very well, then. I've had more of those dreams. I've seen my father again. The last time I saw him, he was in the house. It was about a month ago. As usual, I could not sleep. I went downstairs quite late to get a second volume of the novel which interested me. There was Father walking across a passage. His back was to me. He opened the study door and went in, and he shut it behind him. I rushed to it in order to open it and followed him, but it was locked, and though I screamed through the keyhole, no one replied to me. Mother found me kneeling by the study door and shouting through the keyhole to Father. She was up and dressed, which seemed strange at so late an hour. She took me upstairs and put me to bed and pretended to be angry with me, but when I told her that I had seen Father, she burst into the most awful bitter tears and said, "Oh, Gabrielle, he is dead, quite dead." Then he comes here from the dead, I said. No, he's not dead. I've just seen him. My poor child, said Mother. I must take you to a good doctor without delay. You must not get this thing on in your brain. Very well, I replied. But I am quite willing to see Dr. Mackenzie. I interrupted the narrative to inquire who Dr. Mackenzie was. He is a family physician, replied the young lady. He has attended us for years. And what did your mother say when you proposed to see him? She shivered violently and said, No, I won't have him in my house. After a time, she decided to bring me to you. And have you had that hallucination again? I inquired. It was not a hallucination, she answered, pouting her lips. I will humor you, I answered. Have you seen your father again? No, and I'm likely not to. Why do you think that? I cannot quite tell you. I think Mother's in it. Mother is very unhappy about something, and she looks at me at times as if she were afraid of me. Here Miss Heathcote rose. I said I was not to stay long, she remarked. Now I have told you everything. You see that it is absolutely impossible for ordinary medicines to cure me, any more than ordinary medicines can cure my mother of her awful dreams. I did not know that your mother dreamt badly, I said. She does so, but she doesn't speak of it. She dreams so badly she cries out terribly in her sleep, and that she has moved from her old bedroom next to mine to one of the distant wing of the house. Poor mother, I'm sorry for her, but I'm glad to at least have the courage to tell you what I've seen. You will make it your business to find out the truth now, won't you? What do you mean? I asked. Why, of course. My father's alive, she retorted. You've got to prove that he is, and to give him back to me again. I leave the matter in your hands. I know you're wise and very clever. Goodbye, goodbye. The queer girl left me, tears rolling down her cheeks. I was obliged to attend to other patients, but it was impossible for me to get Miss Heathcote's story out of my head. There was no doubt whatsoever that she was telling the truth, what she firmly believed to be the truth. She had either seen her father once more in the flesh, or she was a victim of a very strong hallucination. In all probability, the latter supposition was the correct one. A man could not die and have a funeral and yet still be alive. But then, on the other hand, When Miss Heathcote brought Gabrielle to see me yesterday, she had not mentioned the central principal figure of her malady. Mrs. Heathcote had said nothing whatsoever in regard to Gabrielle's delusions. Then why was the mother so nervous? Why did she say nothing about her own bad dreams, dreams so disturbing that she was obliged to change her bedroom in order that her daughter should not hear her screams? "I leave the matter in your hands," Miss Heathcote had said. Poor child. She had done so with a vengeance. I could not get the story out of my thoughts, so uncomfortable did the whole thing make me that I determined to pay a visit to Dr. Mackenzie. Mackenzie was a physician in a very large practice in Brixton. His name was already familiar to me. On one or two occasions I had met him in consultation. I looked up his address in the medical directory, and that very evening I took a hansom to his house. He happened to be at home. I sent my card and was admitted at once. Mackenzie received me in his consulting room, and I was not long for explaining the motive of my visit. After a few preliminary remarks, I said that I would be glad if he would favor me with the particulars in regard to Heathcote's death. "I can easily do that," said Mackenzie. "The case was a perfectly straightforward one. My patient was consumptive, had been for years, and he died in the last of hypothesis." "What aged man was he?" I asked. "Oh, not old, a little past 40. Tall, slight, good-looking man with a somewhat emaciated face. In short, he was an ordinary case of consumption." I told Mackenzie all about the visit which I had received from Mrs. Heathcote, and gave him a more faithful version of the strange story which Miss Gabrielle Heathcote had told me that day. "Miss Gabrielle is an excitable girl," replied the doctor. "I've had a good deal to do with her for many years, and always thought of her nerves highly strung. She is evidently the victim of delusion caused by the effect of grief in somewhat delicate organism. She probably inherits her father's disease. Mrs. Heathcote should take her from home immediately." "Mrs. Heathcote looks as if she needs a change of almost as badly as her daughter," I answered. "But now, you will forgive me if I ask a few more questions. Will you oblige me by describing Heathcote's death as faithfully as you can?" "Certainly," replied the physician. He sank down into the chair on the opposite side of the hearth as we spoke. "The death, when it came," he continued, "was, I must confess, unexpected. I had sounded Heathcote's lungs about 3 months prior to the time of his death and seizure. Physicist was present, but not to an advanced degree. I recommended his wintering abroad. He was a solicitor by profession and had a good practice. I remember his asking me, with a comical rise of his brows, how he was to carry on his profession so many miles from Chancery Lane. But to come to his death, it took place 6 months ago, at the beginning of September. It had been a hot season, and I had just returned from my past holiday. My portmanteau and Gladstone bag had been placed in the hall, and I was paying the cableman his fare, when the servant came from Heathcote arrived and begged me to go immediately to her master, who she said, was dying. I hurried off to the house without a moment's delay. It's a stone's throw from here. In fact, you can see the walls of the garden from this window in this room in the daytime. I reached the house. Gabrielle was standing in the hall, and I am an old friend of hers. Her face was quite white and had a stunned expression. When she saw me, she rushed to me and clasped one of my hands in both of hers and burst into tears. "Go and save him," she gasped, her voice choking with sobs, which were almost hysterical. A lady who happened to be staying at the house came and drew the girl away into one of the sitting rooms, and I went upstairs. I found Heathcote in his own room. He was lying on the bed. It was a ghastly sight. His face wore a sick hue of death itself. His sweet hair and even his face were covered with blood. His wife was standing over him, wiping away the blood which oozed from his lips. I saw, of course, immediately what was the matter. Hemotyphus had set in, and I felt that his hours were numbered. "He has broken a blood vessel," exclaimed Miss Heathcote. He was standing here preparing to go down to dinner when he coughed violently and blood began to pour from his mouth. I got him on the bed and sent for you. The hemorrhage seems to be a little less violent now. I examined my patient carefully, feeling his pulse, which was very weak and low. I cautioned him not to speak a single word, and asked Mrs. Heathcote to send for some ice immediately, which she did. I packed him in ice and gave him a dose of ergogen. He seemed easier, and I left him, presuming to work again in an hour or two. Miss Gabrielle met me in the hall as I went out. "Is he any better? Is there hope at all?" she asked as I left the house. "Your father is easier now," I replied. "The hemorrhage has been arrested. I'm coming back soon. You must get a good girl and try to comfort your mother in every way in your power." "And there's no hope," she answered, looking me full in the face. I could not truthfully say that there was. I knew poor Heathcote's days were numbered, although I scarcely thought the end would come so quickly. "What do you mean?" I inquired. "Why, this," he replied. "Less than an hour before I got home, I received a brief note from Mrs. Heathcote, and it stated that the fresh and very violent hemorrhage had set in almost immediately after I left, and that her husband was dead." "And," I continued, "well, that is the story. Poor Heathcote had died of hemoptysis." "Did you see the body after death?" I inquired after a pause. "No, it was absolutely unnecessary. The cause of death was so evident. I attended the funeral, though. Heathcote was buried in Kensington Green." I made no comment for a moment or two. "I'm sorry you did not see the body after death," I said after a pause. My remark seemed to irritate Mackenzie. He looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Would you have thought it necessary to do so?" he asked. "A man known to be consumptive dies of violent hemorrhage of his lungs. The family are in great trouble. There is much besides to think of. Would you, under any circumstances, have considered it necessary to refuse to give a certificate without seeing the body?" I thought for a moment. "I always make a rule about seeing the body," I replied. "But of course you are justified as the law stands. Well then, there is no doubt Heathcote is really dead." "Really dead?" retorted Mackenzie. "Don't you understand that he has been in his grave for 6 months, that I particularly saw him die? And I attended his funeral. By the possible chance can the man be alive?" "None," I replied. "He is dead, of course. I'm sorry for the poor girl. She ought to leave home immediately." "Girls of her age often have delusions," said Mackenzie. "I have no doubt this will pass in time. I'm surprised, however, that the Heathcotes allowed to bring the thing so long. I remember now that they have never been near the house since the funeral. I never understand their not calling me in." "That fact puzzles me as well," I said. "They came to me, a total stranger, instead of consulting their family physician, and Mrs. Heathcote carefully concealed the most important part of her daughter's malady. It is strange altogether, and although I can give no explanation whatsoever, I am convinced that there is one if we could only get to it. One more question before I go, Mackenzie. You spoke of Heathcote as a solicitor. Has he left his family well off?" "They're not rich," replied Mackenzie, "but as far as I can tell, they don't seem to be in want for money. I believe their house, Ivy Hall is its name, belongs to them. They live there very quietly, with a couple maid servants. I should say they belong to the well-to-do middle class." "Then money troubles cannot explain the mystery," I replied. "Believe me, there is no mystery," answered Mackenzie in an annoyed voice. I held out my hand to wish him goodbye, when a loud peal from the front door startled us both. If ever there was a frantic haste in anything, there was the ringing peal. "Someone wants you in a hurry," I said to the doctor. He was about to reply when the door of the consulting room was flung wide open and Gabrielle Heathcote rushed into the room. "Mother is very ill," she exclaimed. "I think she is out of her mind. Come to her at once." She took Mackenzie's hand in hers. There isn't a minute to lose, she said. She may kill herself. She came to me with a carving knife in her hand. I rushed away at you at once. 2 servants are here with me now. They're doing all they can, but, oh, pray, do come quick. At this moment, Gabrielle's eyes rested on me. A look of relief and almost ecstasy passed over her poor thin little face. You are here, she exclaimed. You will come too. Oh, how glad I am. If Dr. Mackenzie will permit me, I replied, I shall be only too pleased to accompany him. By all means, come. You may be the greatest use, he answered. We started at once. As soon as we left the house, Gabrielle rushed from us. I'm going to have the front door open for both of you when you arrive, she exclaimed, and disappeared as if wings were in the wind. That is a good girl, I said, turning to the other doctor. She's always deep attached to both her parents, he answered. We did not either of us say another word until we got to Ivy Hall. It was a rambling old house with numerous low rooms and a big entrance hall. I could fancy that in the summer it was cheerful enough with its large walked-in garden. The night was a dark one, but there was a moon presently. Gabrielle was waiting in the hall to receive us. I will take you to the door of my mother's room, she exclaimed. Her words came out trembling. Her face was like death. She was shaking all over. She ran up the stairs before us, and then down a long passage which led to a room in the little part a rest away from the house. I told your mother wished to sleep in the room as far away from me as possible, she said, flashing a glance into my face as she spoke. I nodded in reply. We opened the door and went in. The sight which met our eyes was one which most medical men are familiar. The patient was lying on the bed in a state of violent delirium. The 2 maidservants were bending over her and evidently much exciting her feelings in their efforts to hold her down. I spoke at once with authority. You can leave the room now, I said. Only remain within call in case you are wanted. They obeyed instantly, looking at me with surprised glances, and at Mackenzie with the manifest relief. I shut the door after them and approached the bed. One glance showed me that Mrs. Heathcote was mad in the ordinary sense, but she was suffering from a moment of acute delirium. I put my hand on her forehead, and it burned with fever. Her pulse was rapid and uneven. Mackenzie took her temperature, which was very nearly 104 degrees. While we were examining her, she remained quiet, but presently we stood together and watched her, and she began to rave again. What is it, Gabriel? No, he is quite dead, child. I tell you, I saw the men screw his coffin down. He is dead, quite dead. Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, dead! She sat up in bed and stared straight before her. You mustn't come here so often, she said, looking past us into the center of the room, and addressing someone whom she seemed to see with distinctness. I tell you it isn't safe. Gabrielle suspects. Don't come so often. I'll manage some other way. Trust me. Do trust me. You know I won't let you starve. Oh, go away. Go away. She flung herself back to the bed and pressed her hands frantically to her burning eyes. Your father's been dead 6 months now, Gabriel, she said presently in a changed voice. No one was ever more dead. I tell you, I saw him die. He was buried, and you went to his funeral. Here again her voice altered. She sat upright with the motion in her hand. Will you bring the coffin in here, please? Into this room? Yes, it seems a nice coffin. Well furnished. The coffin is made from oak. That is right, oak glass. You can't hear coffins that crumble away very quickly. This is a good one. You'll have taken pains with it. I'm pleased. Lay him in gently. He's not very heavy, is he? You see how worn he is? Consumption, yes, consumption. He has been a long time dying, and at the end of his life, suddenly the hemorrhage of his lungs. We did it to save Gabrielle, to keep away. What are you going to keep away? No, yes, dishonor. Look. Here she burst into a loud laugh. I don't suppose you Undertaker's men are going to tell you what you did with it. Dr. Mackenzie was there. We saw him just as the end. Now you placed him in nicely in his coffin and you can go. Thank you, you can go now. You don't want to see his face. Dead face is too scared. You must not look into it. He is peaceful, only pale, only pale. Only dead people look pale. That's pale as most dead people. Oh, I forgot. You can't see him. Are you cold? Oh, yes, I think quite so. You want to screw his coffin in? Of course, of course. I was forgetting. Now be quick about it. Why do you... I was very nearly having him buried with the coffin open. Screw away now, screw away. Oh, how the noise grates on my nerves. I shall go mad if it were not quick. Do be quick, and leave me alone with my dead. Oh, God, with my dead, my dead. The wretched woman's voice sank into a hoarse whisper. She struggled on her knees, and folding her hands, began to pray. God in heaven, have mercy upon me and upon my dead, she moaned. Now, and where's the screwdriver? Oh, heavens, it's lost. We're undone. My God, what is the matter with me? My brain reels. Oh God, my God. She moaned fearfully, laid her back on the bed. Her mutterings became more rapid and indistinct. Presently she slept. She must not be left in this condition, said Mackenzie to me. It would be very bad for Gabrielle to see her mother now, and those young servants are not to be trusted. I will go and send in a nurse as soon as possible. Can you do me the inestimable favor in remaining here until the nurse arrives? I was going to suppose that I should, in this case. Spend one night here, I replied. That is more than good of you, said the doctor. Not at all, I answered. The case interests me extremely. A moment or two later, Mackenzie left the house. During his absence, Mrs. Heathcote slept, and I sat and watched her. The fever raged very high. She muttered constantly her terrible dreams, but said nothing coherent. I felt very anxious about her. She had evidently been subject to a most frightful strain, and now all her nature was giving away. I dared not think that her words implied. My mission was at present to do what I could to relieve her. The nurse arrived around midnight. She was a sensible, middle-aged woman, very strong, too, and evidently accustomed to fever patients. I gave her some directions, desired her to ring a certain bell if she required any assistance. I left the room. As I went downstairs, I noticed the moon had risen. The house was perfectly still. The sick woman's moans could not be heard beyond the distant wing of the house where she slept. As I went downstairs, I remembered Gabriel's story about the moonlit garden and her father's figure standing there. I felt a momentary curiosity to see what the garden was like, and moving aside the blind, which concealed one of the lobby's windows, I looked out. I gave one hurried glance and started back. Was I, too, the victim of illusion? Standing in the garden was the tall figure of a man with folded arms. He was looking away from me, but the light fell on his face. It was cadaverous and ghastly white. His hat was off. He moved into a deep shadow. It was all done in an instant. He came and went like a flash. I pursued my way softly downstairs. This man's appearance seemed exactly to coincide with Mackenzie's description of Heathcote. But it was possible, in any of my wonderful possibilities on this earth, that a man could rise from his coffin and walk the earth again. Gabrielle was waiting for me in the cheerful drawing room. A bright fire burned at the grate, and there were candles in brackets, and one or two shaped lamps placed on the small tables. On one table, a little larger than the rest, white cloth was spread. It also contained a tray with glasses, some claret, sherry, and decanters, and a plate of sandwiches. You must be tired, said Gabrielle. Please take a glass of wine and please eat something. I know those sandwiches are good. I made them myself. She pressed me to eat and drink. In truth, I needed refreshments. The scene in the sick room had told even on my iron nerves, and the sight from the lobby window had almost taken my breath away. Gabrielle attended on me as if she were my daughter. I was touched by her solitude and by the really noble way in which she tried to put herself out at night. At last she said, in a voice which shook with emotion, I know, Dr. Halifax, that you think badly of my mother. Your mother is very ill indeed, I answered. It is good of you to come to help her. You are a great doctor, are you not? I smiled at the child's question. I want to tell you something in the beginning of your mother's illness, I said after a pause. When I saw her 2 days ago, she scarcely considered herself ill at all. In fact, you were supposed to be the patient. Gabrielle dropped into the nearest chair. There is a mystery somewhere, she said, but I cannot make it out. When I came back after seeing you today, Mother seemed very restless and troubled. I thought she would have questioned me about being so long away and asked me at least what I had done with myself. Instead of that, she asked me to tread softly. She said that she had such an intolerable headache that she could not endure the least sound. I saw that she had been out, and she had her walking boots on, and they were covered with mud. I tried to coax her to eat something, but she would not, and as I saw her she really wished to be alone, I left her. At tea time, our parlour maid, Peters, told me that Mother had gone to bed, and had given directions that she was on no account to be disturbed. I had tea alone, and then I came in here and made a place as bright and comfortable as I could. Once or twice before, since my father's death, Mother had suffered from acute headaches and has gone to bed. But when they got better, she was dressed and come downstairs again. I thought she might like to do so tonight, and that she would be pleased to see a bright room and everything cheerful about her. I got a storybook and tried to read, but my thoughts were of my mother, and I felt dreadfully puzzled and anxious. The time seems very long, too. I wished heartily that the night were over. I went upstairs about 8 o'clock and listened outside Mother's door. She was moaning and talking to herself. It seemed to me that she was saying dreadful things. I quite shuddered as I listened. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer. Then I turned the handle and tried to enter, but the door was locked. I went downstairs again, and Peter asked if I would like supper. She was still in the room, and I had not made up my mind whether I could eat anything or not, when I heard her give a short scream, and turning around I saw Mother standing in the room with her nightdress. She had a carving knife in her hand. Gabrielle, she said in a quiet voice, but with an awful look in her eyes, I want to tell you the truth. Is there any blood on my hands? No, Mother, I answered. She gave a deep sigh, and then looked at them as if she were Lady Macbeth. Gabrielle, she said again, I can't live any longer without your father. I've made this knife sharp. It won't take long. Then she turned and left the room. Peters ran for the cook, and they went upstairs after her, and I rushed for Dr. Mackenzie. It was a fearful ordeal for you, I said, and you bravely handled it bravely. And you must not think too much about your mother's condition, nor about any words which she happens to say. She is highly feverish at present, and she is not accountable for her actions. Sit down now, please, and take a glass of wine yourself. No, thank you. I never take wine. I'm glad to hear you say that, for in case a glass of good claret will do wonders for you. Here, I'm going to pour you out one. Now drink it off at once. She obeyed me with a patient sort of smile. She was very pale, but the wine brought some color into her cheeks. I am interested in your story, I said after a pause, particularly in what you have told me about your poor father. He must have been a very interesting man for you to treasure his memory so deeply. Do you mind describing him to me? She flushed when I spoke up. I saw that there were tears very near her eyes, but she bit her lip to keep back emotion. My father was like no one else, she said. It was impossible for me to make a picture of him for one of who has not seen him. But you can at least tell me, was he tall or short, dark or fair, old or young? No, I can't, she said after another pause. He was just father. When you love your father, he has a kind of eternal youth, and you don't discriminate his features. If you're his only child, he is just the one face in all the world to you. I find it impossible to describe his face, although it fills my mind's eye, waking and sleeping. But stay, I have a picture of him. I don't show it to many, but you shall see it. She rushed out of the room, returning in a moment with a morocco case. She opened it and brought over a candle in the same time, so that the light should fall upon the picture within. It represented a tall, slight man with deep-set eyes and a very thin face. The eyes were somewhat piercing in their glance. The lips were closely set and firm, and the chin was cleft. The face showed determination. I gave it a quick glance, and closing the case, returned it to Gabrielle. The face was the face of the man I had seen in the garden. My patient passed a dreadful night. She was no better the next morning. Her temperature was rather higher, her pulse quicker, and her respiration more hurried. Her ravings had now become almost incoherent. Mackenzie and I had another anxious consultation over her. When he left the house, I accompanied him. "I'm going to make a strange request of you," I said. "I wish for your assistance, and I'm sure you will not refuse to give it to me. In short, I want to make an immediate steps to have Heathcote's coffin opened." I'm quite sure Mackenzie thought that I was mad. He looked at me, opened his lips as if to speak, then waited to hear my next words. "I want to have Heathcote's body exhumed," I said. "If you'll listen to me, I will tell you why." Then I gave him a graphic account of the man I had seen in the garden. "There is foul play here somewhere," I said, in conclusion. "I've been dragged into this thing almost against my will, and now I'm determined to see it through." Mackenzie flung up his hands. "I don't pretend to doubt your wisdom," he said, "but to ask me gravely to assist to exhume the body of a man who died of consumption 6 months ago, it's enough to take my breath away. What reason can you possibly give to the authorities of such an action?" "I have strong grounds for believing that the death never took place at all," I replied. "Now, will you cooperate with me in this matter or not?" "Oh, of course I'll cooperate with you," he answered. "But I don't pretend to say that I like the business." We walked together to his house, talking things over, the necessary steps which must be taken in order to get an exhumation. Mackenzie promised to telegraph to me as soon as ever this was obtained, and I was obliged to hurry off to attend to my own duties. As I was stepping into my hansom, I turned to ask the doctor one more question. "Have you any reason to suppose Heathcote was heavily insured?" I asked. "No, I don't know anything about it," he answered. "You're quite sure there's no money troubles at all?" "I do not know of any, but that fact amounts to nothing, for I was not really intimate with the family, and as I said yesterday evening, never entered the house until last night from the day of the funeral. I've never heard of money troubles, but, of course, they might have existed." "As soon as ever I hear from you, I will make an agreement to meet you at Kensal Green," I replied, and then I jumped into the hansom and drove away. In the course of the day, I got the telegram acquainting me with Mrs. Heathcote's condition. I still remained absolutely unchanged, and there was, in Mackenzie's opinion, no necessity for me to pay her another visit. Early the next morning, the required order came from the coroner. Mackenzie wired and praised me of the fact, and I telegraphed back, making an appointment to meet him at Kensal Green on the following morning. I shall not soon forget that day. It was one of those blustering and intensely cold days that come oftener in March than any other time of year. The cemetery looked as dismal as such a place would be on the occasion. A few wreaths of flowers which were scattered here and there on newly made graves were sodden and deprived from all their frail beauty. The wind blew in great gusts, which were about every 10 minutes accompanied by showers of sleet. There was a hollow moaning noise distinctly audible in the intervals of the storm. I found, on my arrival, that Mackenzie was there before me. He was accompanied by one of the coroner's men and a police constable. 2 men who were working on the cemetery also came forward to assist. No one expressed the least surprise at our strange errand. Around Mackenzie's lips alone, I read the expression of disapproval. Kensal Green is one of the oldest cemeteries which surround our vast metropolis. and one of the Heathcote's burying place was quite the oldest portion of the God's Acre. It was one of the hideous, ancient, rapidly going out of date vaults. A huge brick erection was placed over it, at one side, which was the door of the entrance. The earth was removed, and the door of the vault opened, and some of the men went down the steps, one of them holding a torch to ordered to identify the coffin. In a couple of minutes' time, it was borne into the light of day. When I saw it, I remembered poor Mrs. Heathcote's wild ravings. "A good, strong oak coffin, which wears well," she had exclaimed. Mackenzie and I, accompanied by the police constable and the coroner's man, followed the bearers of the coffin to the mortuary. As we were going there, I turned to ask Mackenzie how his patient was. He shook his head and answered me. "I fear the worst," he replied. "Mrs. Heathcote is very ill indeed." The fever rages high and is like a consuming fire. Her temperature was 105 this morning. Wow. "I should recommend packing her in sheets wrung out of cold water," I answered. "Poor woman. How do you account for the sudden illness, Mackenzie?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Shock of some sort," he answered. And then he continued. "If you really knew of this day's work, it would kill her off pretty quickly. Poor soul," he answered. "I hope it may never reach your ears." We had now reached the mortuary. The men who had borne the coffin on their shoulders lowered it on a pair of tricycles. They then took turns screwdriver out of their pockets and, in a businesslike manner, and unscrewed the lid. After doing this, they left the mortuary, closing the door behind them. The moment we found ourselves alone, I said words to the police constable, and then, going quickly up to the coffin, lifted the lid. Under ordinary circumstances, such a proceeding would have been followed by appalling results, which need not here be described. Mackenzie, whose face was very white, stood near me. I looked at him for a moment, and then flung along the pall which was to conceal the face of the dead. The dead, truly. Here was death, which had never, in any case, known a life like ours. Mackenzie uttered a loud exclamation. The constable and the coroner's man came close and lifted the bag of flour out of the coffin. There were many similar bags here. It had been closely packed and evidently with a few counterfeits the exact weight of the dead man. Poor Mackenzie was absolutely speechless. The coroner's man began to take copious notes. The police constable gravely did the same. Mackenzie at last found his tongue. "I never felt more stunned in my life," he said. "Very truth, but I saw the man die. Where is he? In the name of heaven, what has become of him? This is the most monstrous thing I've ever heard in my whole course of my life. And I attended the funeral for those bags of flour. No wonder the woman never cared to see me inside the house again. But what puzzles me," he continued, "is the motive. What can the motive be?" "Perhaps one of the insurance companies can tell us that," said the police officer. "It is my duty to report this sort of thing." He continued, turning to me. "I have not the least doubt that the Crown will prosecute." "I cannot at all prevent your taking the steps that you think proper," I replied. "Only pray understand that the poor lady who is the principal perpetrator in this fraud lies at the present moment at death's door." "Well, you must get the man himself," remembered the police officer. "If he is alive, we shall find him soon." Half an hour later, Mackenzie and I had left the dismal cemetery. I had to hurry back to Harley Street to attend some important duties, but I arranged to meet Mackenzie that evening at the Heathcote's house. I need not say that my thoughts were much occupied by Mrs. Heathcote and her miserable story. What a life that wretched Heathcote must have led during the last 6 months. No wonder he looked cadaverous in the moonlight as fell over his gaunt figure. No ghost truly was he, but a man of like flesh and blood to ourselves. A man who was supposed to be buried in Kensal Green, but yet who walked the earth. It was about 8 o'clock when I reached the Heathcote's house. Mackenzie had already arrived. He came to the hall to meet me. "Where is Miss Gabrielle?" I asked at once. "Poor child," he replied. "I have begged her to stay in her room. She knows nothing of what took place this morning, but is in a terrible state of grief about her mother. That unfortunate woman's hours are numbered. She is sinking fast. Will you come to her at once, Halifax? She has asked for you several times." I accompanied Mackenzie. I mounted the stairs and entered the sick room. One glance at the patient's face showed me all too plainly that I was in the chamber of death. Mrs. Heathcote lay perfectly motionless. Her bright hair, still the hair of quite a young woman, was flung back over the pillow. Her pale face was wet with perspiration. Her eyes, sullen, dark, and awful in expression, turned and fixed themselves on me as I approached the bedside. Something like the ghost of a smile quivered around her lips. She made an effort to stretch out her shadowy hand to grasp mine. "Don't stir," I said to her. "Perhaps you want to say something. I will stoop down to listen to you. I have very good hearing, so you can speak as low as you please." She smiled again with a sort of pleasure at understanding her. "I have something to confess," she said in a hollow whisper. "Send the nurse and Dr. Mackenzie out of the room." I was obliged to explain the dying woman's wishes to my brother physician. He called to the nurse to follow him, and they immediately left the room. As soon as they had done so, I bent my head to look at Mrs. Hennicote's hands in mine. "Now," I said, "take comfort. God can forgive sin. Have you sinned?" "Oh, yes. But how can you possibly know?" "Never mind. I am a good judge of character. If speaking to me will relieve your conscience, speak." "My husband is alive," she murmured. "Yes," I said, "I guessed as much." "He had insured his life," she continued, "for about £15,000. The money was wanted to save us from dishonor. We managed to counterfeit death." She stopped, as if unable to proceed any further. "A week ago," she continued, "I saw the man who was supposed to be dead. He is really dying now. The strain of knowing that I could do nothing for him, horrible to comfort his last moments, was too horrible. I felt that I could not live without him. On the day of my illness, I took a poison, a preparation of Indian hemp. I meant to kill myself. I did not know that my object would be affected in so terrible a manner." Here she looked towards the door. The great change came over her face. Her eyes shone with sudden brightness. A look of awful joy filled them. She made a frantic effort to raise herself in bed. I followed the direction of her eyes, and then, indeed, a startled exclamation passed my lips. Gabrielle, with her cheeks crimson, her lips tremulous, and her hair tossed wildly about her head and shoulders, was advancing into the room, leading a cadaverous, ghastly-looking man by the hand. In other words, Heathcote himself was in the flesh and had come to see his wife's dying chamber. "Oh, Horace!" she exclaimed. "Horace, to die in your arms! To know that you will soon join me! This is too much bliss! This is too much joy!" The man knelt by her, put his dying arms around her, and she laid her head upon his worn breast. "We will leave them together," I said to Gabrielle. I took the poor little girl's hand and led her from the room. She was in a frantic state of excitement. I said he was not dead, she repeated. Oh, I said it. I was sitting by my window a few minutes ago and I saw him in the garden. This time I was determined that he should not escape me. I rushed downstairs. He knew nothing until he saw me at his side. I caught his hand in mine. It was hot and thin. It was like a skeleton's hand, only it burned with living fire. Mother is dying. Come to her at once, I said to him, and then I brought him into the house. You did well. You acted very bravely, I replied to her. I took her away to a distant part of the house. An hour later, Mrs. Heathcote died. I was not with her when she had breathed her last. My one object now was what to do with poor little Gabrielle. In consequence, therefore, I made arrangements to have her interview with Heathcote. It was no longer possible for a wretched man to remain in hiding. His own hours were plainly numbered, and it was more than evident that he had only anticipated his real death by some months. I saw him the next day, and he told me a few brief words of the story of his supposed death and burial. I'm being severely punished now, he said. For my one great sin of life, I am a solicitor by profession, and when a young man is tempted to appropriate some trust funds, hoping, like many another has done before me, to replace the money that he lost was discovered. I married and had a happy home. My wife and I were devotedly attached to each other, and I was not strong, or more than one physician had told me that I was threatened by some serious pulmonary affection. About 8 months ago, the blow which I never looked for fell. I need not enter into any particulars. Suffice to say that I was expected to deliver over £12,000, the amount of certain trusts committed to me, to the rightful owner within 3 months' time. If I failed to realize this money, imprisonment, dishonor, ruin would be mine. My wife and child would also be reduced to beggary. I had effected an insurance on my life for £15,000. If the sum was to be realized, it would cover the deficit in the trust and also leave a small overplus for the use of my wife and daughter. I knew that my days were practically numbered, and it did not strike me as a particularly heinous crime to forestall my death by a few months. I talked the matter over with my wife, and at last got her to consent to help me. We managed everything cleverly, and not a soul suspected of fraud practiced in the world. Our old servants who had lived with us for some years were sent away on holiday, had no manservant in the house except a chairwoman who came a certain number of hours daily. You managed your supposed dying condition with great skill, I answered. The hemorrhage, the ghastly expression on your face, is sufficiently real to deceive even a keen and clever man like Mackenzie. Heathcote smiled grimly. After all, he said, the fraud was simple enough. I took an emetic, which I knew would produce the cadaverous you approaching death, and the supposed hemorrhage was managed with some bullock's blood. I got it from a distant butcher, telling him that I wanted to mix it with my meal to feed my dogs with. And how did you deceive the undertaker's men, I asked. My wife insisted on keeping my face covered, and I managed to simulate rigidity. As to the necessary coldness, I was cold enough lying with only a sheet over me. After I was placed in the coffin, my wife would not allow anyone to enter the room but herself. She brought me food, of course. We bored holes in the lid and the coffin, too. Still, I shall never forget the awful 5 minutes during which I was screwed down. It was all managed with great expectation. As soon as ever the undertaker's men could have got out of the way, my wife unscrewed the coffin and released me, and we filled the bags with flour, which we had purposely hidden for that same purpose. My supposed funeral took place with due honors. I left the house that night, intending to slip to America. Had I done this, the appalling consequences which have now ended in the death of my wife might never have taken place. But at the 11th hour, my courage failed me. I could not do much to shield my wife and child, but I could not endure the thought of seeing them ever again. Contrary to all my wife's entreaties, I insisted on coming into the garden for the selfish pleasure of catching even a glimpse of Gabrielle's little figure as she moved about her bedroom. She saw me once, and I escaped to the shrubbery by which a door was kept, which we purposefully unlocked before she reached me. I never thought I would ever again transgress, but the more the temptation assailed me, and I was not proof against it. My health failed rapidly. I was really dying, and on the morning when my wife's illness began, I'd suffered from a genuine and sharp attack of a hemorrhage. She found me in the wretched lodging here, and I was hiding in a state of complete misery with almost destitution. Something in my appearance seemed suddenly to make her lose all self-control. "Horace," she exclaimed, "I cannot stand this. When you die, I will die. We will carry our shame and our sorrow to our unhappy love into the grave, where no man can follow us. When you die, I shall die. Oh, to see you like this drives me mad." She left me. She told me when I saw her during those last moments yesterday that she had hastened to end by powerful use of Indian hemp. That is the story. I know that I have laid myself open to criminal prosecution of the gravest character, but I do not think I shall live to go through with it. Heathcote was right. He passed away that evening, quietly in his sleep. Poor little Gabrielle. I saw her once since her parents' death, but it is now a couple of years since I have heard anything about her. Will she ever get over the severe shock to which she was subjected? What does she hold in the future to store for her? I cannot answer these questions. Time alone can answer that.